Hi everyone, I'm back with my top 10 tips for Mounce chapter 19. And I'd like to begin with a word of introduction. As Mounce says, participles are special. I'm not sure if he says this tongue-in-cheek or not, but participles, like infinitives, may not come to you quickly as beginning Greek students. Do keep working at them though, because they're common and because they're meaningful in the Greek New Testament once you get the hang of how they work. Mounce reminds you he calls them verbal adjectives, but I call them platypus verbs because they are verbs after all, but like a platypus, they have characteristics from other kinds of words like nouns, adjectives, and adverbs, and they can do more than one thing in a sentence. Like nouns or substantive adjectives, they can stand on their own, as Mounce shows you in 19.2. Like adjectives, they can modify nouns or pronouns, like Mounce demonstrates in 19.4. And like adverbs, they can modify verbs, helping to describe how the action of the verb takes place, like Mounce says in 19.3. And incidentally, I provided a picture of the lovable platypus, which is a semi-aquatic egg-laying mammal. And I provided that picture for you on the transcript of this video. So if you don't remember what a platypus looks like, be sure and check it out. And maybe you'll see why I call participles platypus verbs. Now, first thing to do is to look at Mounce 19, sections 1 through 6, and remind yourself how participles can do all the things I've talked about in English. Get those back in your mind. Like nouns or substantive adjectives, participles can stand on their own. Like adjectives, they can modify nouns or pronouns. Like adverbs, they can modify verbs. Then, look at Mounce 19.7. Here's my first tip. Mounce reminds you that outside the indicative mood, tenses don't indicate the time of an action. They indicate only the kind of an action. So the three kinds of actions that participles describe are associated with the three tenses of participles. An aorist participle describes undefined action, but nothing about time. A present participle describes continuing action, but nothing about time. A perfect participle describes a kind of action that's been completed but has continuing effects, and does that without time. Then Mounce moves on to talk about adjectival participles. Here's my tip number 2. Notice the clue that Mounce gives you in 19, section 9. There he shows you how to tell when a participle is an adjectival participle. Adjectival participles normally have definite articles in front of them. Adverbial participles never do. Let me say that again. Adjectival participles normally can be recognized. The clue is they'll have a definite article in front of them. Adverbial participles will never have a definite article in front of them. My tip number 3 also concerns adjectival participles. Adjectival participles can modify nouns or pronouns in Greek just like they can in English by attributing some quality to them. Mounce shows you how this works in 19.10 and 19.11. Here's my 4th tip, my last one about adjectival participles. Adjectival participles can act like and replace nouns or pronouns. Technically now, they don't become nouns. They're still adjectives. They are substantive adjectives, adjectives that we met in the chapter on modifiers that can substitute for a noun. But adjectival participles can act like and replace nouns. They can substitute for nouns, like a substantive adjective. Mounce shows you how in 19.12. So there are the uses of adjectival participles. Now, Mounce moves on to talk about adverbial participles. Adverbial participles modify verbs. Adjectival participles modify nouns or pronouns. Adverbial participles, let me say a word of introduction about them. As in English, adjectival participles in Greek function in many and deeply meaningful ways. They tell us more about how the action of the verb that they modify as an adverb, how that action takes place. In this chapter, Mounce introduces you to 5 ways an adverbial participle can do that. 5 ways an adverbial participle can modify a verb. Now, don't worry about 19.13 in Mounce. He's only trying to explain why most adverbial participles are nominative. That's nice to know, but not really essential, because the case doesn't affect the meaning. Here's my first tip about adverbial participles. The first of the 5 ways an adverbial participle can modify a verb. The first of the 5 ways that an adverbial participle can modify a verb is in a way that turns the adverbial participle into what's called a temporal adverbial participle. Temporal adverbial participles describe time in relationship to the verb they modify. Mounce describes this kind of adverbial participle initially in 19.14. And he talks about this kind of participle more extensively and how to translate it in 19.19 through 19.22 at the end of the chapter. I don't know why he chose to separate 19.14 from 19.19 through 22, but I would encourage you after you read 19.14 to go on and look at 19.19 through 19.22, because all of these sections are talking about temporal adverbial participles, adverbial participles that describe time in relationship to the verb they modify. The basic idea to hold on to is that with temporal adverbial participles, there may be a difference in meaning. Adverbial participles that are aorist tense indicate the action described by the participle happens before the action of the main verb, some of the time. Present adverbial participles indicate the action described by the participle. The action described by the participle happens at the same time as the action of the main verb, most of the time. I say most of the time because grammarians are now finding that this distinction, which we used to teach as happening all of the time, may not really be happening all of the time. So remember, aorist temporal participles action before the action of the main verb most of the time. Present adverbial participles that are temporal describe action that happens at the same time as the action of the main verb most of the time. The second of the 5 ways an adverbial participle can describe a verb is by describing how the action of the verb takes place. This kind of adverbial participle is called an adverbial participle of means. Mounce describes it in 19.13 very well. The third way an adverbial participle can function to modify the meaning of a verb and make it more meaningful is by describing why the action of the verb takes place. It's called a causal adverbial participle when it does that. It tells you the reason why the action takes place. The fourth of the 5 ways an adverbial participle can function to modify the meaning of a verb and tell you more about what the verb is trying to say in Greek is that it can be conditional. A conditional adverbial participle describes a condition or a set of conditions that have to be fulfilled in order for the action of the verb to take place. Mounce describes this kind of participle in 19.15. The fifth way and the final way of the 5 ways that an adverbial participle can modify and tell you more about the action of a main verb is that an adverbial participle can be concessive. A concessive adverbial participle is conceding something, conceding that the action of the verb takes place, although or in spite of the fact that the action of the participle describes. Mounce gives you a great example and describes this kind of participle in 19.16. So this chapter is all about participles. Participles are platypus words that function in one way, like verbs, they describe action, but in other ways as well, like nouns or pronouns or adjectives or adverbs. You'll find them mostly as describing verbs, as adverbial participles in the New Testament. Most of the participles in the New Testament are adverbial. So remember the 5 ways an adverbial participle can modify a verb. It can tell you about the time of action in relationship to the verb it modifies. It can tell you about how the action of the verb takes place, if it's a participle of means. It can tell you about why the action of the verb takes place, if it's a causal participle. It can describe the conditions that have to be fulfilled for the action of the verb to take place. It's a conditional adverbial participle when it does that. Or it can concede something. It can concede that the action of the verb takes place, although or despite the fact that the action of the participle describes, takes place. Even though the action the participle describes, when it's concessive, even though that action takes place, the action of the main verb still takes place. That's a concessive adverbial participle. So remember the adverbial participle uses. Remember the way that you can tell an adverbial participle from an adjectival participle. Adjectival participles have definite articles in front of them. Adverbial participles never do. And then remember, if you find a participle with a definite article in front of it, it is either modifying a noun or a pronoun, like an attributive adjective would do, or it's standing in the place of a noun or a pronoun, in which case it technically is a substantive adjective, but it is substituting for a noun or a pronoun, as Mounce shows you in 19.12. That's a lot to take in. Participles are special and they seem complicated, but do keep working at them because they are common in the Greek New Testament and they are very meaningful once you get the hang of how they work and what kind of action they're trying to describe, if they're adverbial in relationship to the verb, and how they're modifying the noun or standing in the place of a noun if they're adjectival participles. I hope all this information is helpful to you. If you want to ask about anything in Mounce or about what I've said to you, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me.